Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Other Job Podcast, a place where we explore all those tasks that are required for building high-performance teams, but we never seem to have enough time to do or to do well. We started this podcast to share learnings from being there and doing that for those who want to go there and do that, and to hear from voices in the industry to share their own lived experiences. Today, we're joined by Garrett Marker, a sales leader over at Braze. We worked together building the go-to-market motion at another fintech called Even, and we learned a lot about how to interview, how to build teams, because we were in the go-to-market scale-up phase. And so I invited Garrett on to talk a little bit about how those first and second-time leaders can interview and build a process to building their team. Garrett, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Garrett, could you give just maybe the audience a little bit of your background and why, I think a lot of people think about hiring when they first get their open headcount, which is like, I need to get this over as quickly as possible, and I need to get this person in seat delivering revenue. Maybe just a little bit of your background and why you maybe take a little bit of a different approach about how you interview and build your team.
Yeah. So as far as my background, I've been fortunate to get to work with a lot of great people at a few different great companies. So I started my career at LinkedIn, started as a BDR. So right as the entry levels you can go get, and have the opportunity there to do various roles from SMB, mid-market, enterprise sales, global accounts, a lot of different things in between. Then kind of actually took my first journey into leadership at a startup. So I went from never having managed people before to not only doing that for the first time, but doing that at a Series A company with no brand name and no customers, and in some ways no product, which was a little bit of a switch. Obviously, you mentioned Even, where we got to go work together after that and kind of scaled the business from there. And obviously now work at Braze and lead a big chunk of our global sales organization. But to your point around hiring and kind of why that's so important, if you've been in sales long enough, you've looked at a dashboard. And if you looked at a dashboard, you have seen that the delta between the person who's at the top and the person at the bottom is always quite large. And so there's many things that can go into that. It can be territory, it could be enablement, it could be a lot of different components. But one of the ingredients is the individual that you hire, right? Are they the right fit for your business? Are they someone who can be successful in that role? Do they have the right skills required to go be successful at your organization? And so through that, I've always felt like making sure that you're trying to go hire for the right people who can not just be successful in that role, but ideally can then grow with the company into larger roles that kind of contribute more revenue or have a bigger impact overall business is really, really important, because you can't get it right unless you have the right people in place. And as I think have experienced, sometimes when you hire the wrong person, it can have a cascading effect across the organization. So it's something I've always found is really important. And so with anything that's important, I think you should be really thoughtful about it.
So Garrett, that kind of begs the obvious question here, which is like when you're looking at that dashboard, and this, by the way, like I know this is only like half of a hiring question, half of a leader conversation, maybe. But like maybe just walk people, like when you're looking through that dashboard, how do you figure out if it's a hiring problem versus a territory problem versus a sales execution problem versus some other myriad of problems?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different components to it, but I think a couple tangible ones are, I think it's really important to run what I call a customer development process. So you've ever read like lean startup methodology and they talk about crossing the chasm. One of the things they talk about when trying to establish product market fit and scale is running a customer development process, which is you get a list of 10 to 15 questions. You go talk to people who you think would be your buyer. You ask them those same 10 to 15 questions and you try to see, do you get consistent answers? And once you get the consistent answers, that kind of tells you what to go build, right? Because you've now figured out who your customer is, what they want, what they care about, and you can kind of go build for that. And so applying that to hiring, if you look at the dashboard and you see a lot of people being really successful, a natural place to start is to go talk to all of them, have a list of 10 to 15 questions and ask them things like, what do you think you do better or different than the rest of the team? What do you attribute most of your success to? What are the 3 things you think you're particularly good at? How do you think about your book of business, right? Some questions to kind of understand what are the commonalities behind the people that have overall been successful. If you kind of are hearing, as an example, like, oh, I just have the best territory, well, then you might know in that kind of process that it's maybe less the people and more a RevOps or kind of a territory planning process. But I find that when you do those kind of interviews, you tend to find that there's some commonalities behind how those people work. And when you do so, whether it's a talent problem or not, you can kind of figure out who are the type of people and what are the characteristics that high performers have in common. And then you can make sure that no matter what, that part of the equation, hiring the right people, isn't going to be the broken part.
So Garrett, first of all, I've never met a rep that said I'm successful because I had an awesome territory. So we'll get that out of the way. But also, okay, great. So you've now pattern matched and effectively found like what's the model rep. The concept that I actually introduced in our first episode of the podcast, and something I learned from you, was translating those things into an ideal candidate profile. What does that look like? Is it as simple as what it sounds like, or what's in your ideal candidate profile that you're using to make sure that you're talking to the right people?
Yeah, I believe it's as simple as it sounds, right? And I think what it is essentially the distilled list of characteristics that an individual will have or will have been able to demonstrate through the experiences they've had in life and their professional experience that demonstrate that in your environment, they should go be successful. So like a really tactical example is, I think if you're at a company that's small, right, scale up, startup, pre-product market fit, those kind of stage companies, you can't look around and just find the answers from someone else, right? When you're at a really, really big company, everybody's figured it out. It's all done. Playbook's there. Answers are there. Very simple. But an early company, you kind of need to go figure it out. And so I find a trait sometimes that is common amongst people who've been successful at earlier stages companies is what I've often defined as they're comfortable being uncomfortable. They're okay with not knowing what the answer is. They're okay with ambiguity. And so if you have that as kind of a trait that you're looking for, when you then build your interview process, you can actually ask questions specifically to see, have they demonstrated that they're comfortable being uncomfortable, or have they worked through that kind of opaqueness? So it can look like, a question about life, which is like, hey, when was a time where you were going through a really challenging moment in your life, and how did you go push through that, aspect of what was going on? Or, hey, was there ever a time when you had imposter syndrome when moving into a different role, and how did you work through that, right? Or was there ever a time when you took over a role within your organization where you're doing something new that you hadn't done before, right? And how did you go figure that out? And you can see in the examples of, first of all, do they have one? Is always an interesting tell, but also when they give the example, does it demonstrate through that they had to go through something challenging, and even though they were met with headwinds, they're able to kind of go push through those components. So I do think it's as simple as it sounds, right? Because it's just translating that pattern recognition to what are the 6 or 7 traits that they're demonstrating, right? Is it they're all curious? Are they all analytical? Are they all collaborative? What are those components? And then you translate that to an interview process. No different, quite frankly, than selling, right? We have an ICP for our ideal customer profile. We build a sales process of here's the steps we want to go through and the different actions we want to go take. We look for different signals there to figure out if someone might buy and if someone might be a good fit. So in a lot of ways, it's very similar to what you do on the sales side. It's just now your ICP is an individual that you want to work with, not a company you want to sell to.
So Garrett, I think what's not as simple is the set of questions to ask that help us understand if somebody does have those characteristics. Obviously, you can't just show up and ask somebody, "Do you have this characteristic?" Where did you learn how to ask good questions? Because I think it's Jeff and I's audience. If you will, is, we're trying to help people that are kind of new to leadership roles. And this is one of the first things they're going to tackle as a new leaders, hiring. And many people don't get any sort of like really great training and help along this process. So I'd love to hear, like, where did you learn to ask great questions to help assess whether or not somebody has the characteristics in an ICP?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways that for me, and I think for others, I've seen people work through that. I think one is you leverage the experience you do have. So I find most people who are going to be first-time managers or second-time managers as a sales leader, oftentimes were a sales rep before them. And so part of their job was to do discovery and ask good questions of the individuals they were trying to go sell to. And so while they may not know the subject matter, right, they know the idea of being curious and trying to understand like the first principle of something and go a little bit deeper. So I find that first it's starting with, okay, once you've learned the traits behind the different individuals, it's thinking, okay, if this were a buyer and I was trying to go figure out had they done these things or were they a fit, what kind of questions would I have asked them, right? And see how some of those might translate to this. So like a classic question I see some people ask on the sales side is, if you can wave a magic wand, right, with XYZ topic, how would you do that? That kind of question can translate very easily on the hiring side. I agree with you, Chris. It's not as simple as like, hey, if you can wave a magic wand and be curious, like how would that look, right? But you can kind of find a way to go translate that to what you're doing. So I think that's one example. And I think another thing which I encourage all kind of people moving into a new or different role to do is build a unique personal board of directors who have had experience going through what you're about to go through to be able to leverage for help with some of those different areas. No one should have to go figure out as a first-time manager how to reinvent the wheel themselves. And just because your company doesn't provide enablement and your manager is maybe not helping there, I always tell everybody that I work with that if you are entirely outsourcing your professional development to your direct manager, you're selling yourself short. You're not always going to have good managers, right? You should actually spend the time to develop a network of people who've gone through that. And so as an example, if you're a first-time manager, if you're at a company that has other sales managers, great. Figure out who those people are, figure out who you think has kind of hired good people, right? If you did interviews and found most of the good reps are on one team, maybe spend some time with those hiring managers to kind of understand how they do it and map it back to your process, or find people at other companies, right? That have moved into those roles, friends from college, friends from previous companies, whatever it may be, and use that to kind of pattern recognize. So when you get stuck, you can ask them, hey, I'm trying to figure out how someone's curious. Like, have you ever interviewed for that before? If so, they say yes. What kind of questions did you ask them? And that can now be your starting point. Because I think for a lot of people, the challenge is, I don't know where to start. But once you get a couple examples, you can tend to figure out the rest from there.
So Garrett, one thing you didn't say that I actually saw you do really well, which was there are other people at your company well positioned to screen for some of these traits. And so how do you think about assembling an interview panel? We've all been on the receiving end of a hiring manager saying, hey, go talk to that person about culture fit. We're going to talk about that in a second. But also just like, go talk to them about partnerships. You were much more specific when you assembled your loop about like the things you were trying to learn. And you may have people in other departments or part of that interview loop that are good at asking those questions.
Yeah, no, it's a great call out. And actually the kind of example I'll give, because a lot of these things I think in interviewing are very similar to selling, right? And so that's why I'll probably consistently try to have some examples that tie back and forth between the two. But one thing that I learned from you, and I appreciate how you describe kind of sales process, is at time there can be this concept of, let's say individuals are responsible for different elements of the close or the partnership or the cycle, right? So it could be maybe the account executive is responsible for the commercial close, right? So when you're going through the process, they're going to have to go do the commercial negotiations. They're going to have to go develop the strategy there. They're going to have to go work with those core stakeholders. Or maybe someone who's a sales engineer could be responsible for the technical close, right? Their job is maybe to make sure that there's no reason why someone wouldn't buy because of a technical capability within the platform that wasn't understood. Or there's no reason someone shouldn't be able to implement successfully because they did not understand a technical element. So if you apply that same sort of idea of in a sales process, you'd have different stakeholders that own different components. I think you can do the exact same thing in the interview process, right? Like if I'm screening for analytical skills, curiosity, comfortable being uncomfortable, and something different, right? There may be different people at the organization who better fit some of those different components, right? So it could be, hey, when we did the customer development process internally to figure out who the ideal profile we're trying to go hire for is, there's one AE that just like was off the charts on the analytical stuff. They're really, really good there and they have really great experience there. Maybe that's the individual that you would then go bring in to ask questions in an interview around that component, because they should know what good looks like, because good looks like what they've done, right? And that might make it easier for them to go figure out those components, right? If you're looking for kind of collaboration as an example, right? It's maybe something, you're an enterprise sales motion, they have to work with a lot of different people. Maybe you pull someone who is the individual who has to collaborate the most with the account executive that you're hiring for, because the AE may think they do a great job at collaboration, but the real judge of whether that was good or not is the person who had to collaborate with them. And so maybe that individual coming in, asking questions is going to give them the best signal, because they can go internalize and go, if that person worked with me in the way they just described, I wouldn't feel like a partner, right? Whereas if they worked with me in a different way, maybe I would. And so I find that no different than a sales process, you know who your subject matter experts are internally, and you then map them to the right people in the right stages to do that. I think you could do the exact same thing here. It's obviously a little bit different, right? As far as like the profiles you might go pull from, right? You might not pull in a legal person to go handle legal conversations because that's not going to necessarily be one-to-one relevant always for hiring. But I find that kind of same mapping process of thinking about who internally has those experiences, would understand those components better, be able to get better signal in those different areas, owning those parts of those processes. And then obviously you as the hiring manager owning the ones that are more unique to yourself.
So Garrett, this all sounds good, but the reality is most new frontline leaders are going to walk into a pretty orchestrated hiring process, right? It's either run by recruiting or run by their predecessor or run by their boss. What advice would you give to a new leader that wants to go do the things that you're talking about, but that feels like they're in a little bit of a box that has been put around them? Maybe there's already an interview panel in place and they just have to use that panel. Maybe their boss designed the hiring process. And as much as they'd like to go do some of the concepts you're talking about, they're afraid to maybe go outside the constraints put around them.
Yeah, well, I'll answer the question, but a question I'm going to have for you later is, where have you worked? Because I have not found that most companies have a very thoughtful interview process that's well structured, that doesn't change from person to person.
I think most of the companies I've worked at had 5 in like less than 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, like the effort's being made, but you get my point. Like not all of us get to go like design our own hiring process, right?
No, totally fair. And so I find there's a couple things we already talked about that can and should translate no matter what. So that component of doing customer development to understand who is it that's successful here and why. That's not part of the interview process. So everybody can go do that and kind of understand those components and kind of start from there. And let's say you had to keep the exact same interview process today. And for most, account executive interviews, it's something that's like, deal reviews, right? It might be, like a pitch back presentation where they're going to go pitch your software or their previous software and go through that, right? Some sort of like take home assignment. Like it's usually the same sort of activities. It's not changing too much necessarily company to company. And so with that in mind, you could, if you understood, here's the 6 traits I'm looking for, and you're kind of stuck with a certain process, you have the ability to go, okay, if I have to use these formats, what are the best way for me to use these formats to get signal on the core elements that I want to go get information on, right? It's no different than if you come to a company and like they won't do pilots, right? Or they're a PLG company or whatever it is. You're inheriting the existing go-to-market motion, but that doesn't mean you don't have the ability to go figure out, you know what? I actually think I might want to sell this a little bit differently. I might want to ask different discovery questions in those same conversations that are standard. And I'm going to go do something a little bit differently because I have some sort of information that gives me confidence that would work well. So I think that's kind of one easy component, which is still make sure you understand your ICP and then just figure out how to have the current process best allow you to go screen for those elements, right? So I think that's one thing that you can definitely do. I think a longer term thing is taking the time to both, one, document your success and failure and the things that you're going to do a little bit different than other people in that existing process. And 2, make sure that you're asking the individuals who kind of are involved in the process today why the process is the way that it is. And so the reason I give those 2 examples in the first instance, I find the easiest way to get people to do something different is you eventually come to them with data about how the way you're doing it works better, right? So as an example, at my current company, when I got here, we didn't have a sales methodology, which was surprising to me. We're already like 100 million in revenue. And I was like, how do we like not have this in place? This seems like something we'd have at this point in time. And it felt like through kind of some work I'd done, it would be something that would be valuable. But I didn't just go to our CRO and say, hey, we got to go roll this out today. I actually used team members that did A/B testing where I kind of had a couple different methodologies going and had one group do one set of deals, right, using the methodology. One group didn't. And after a period of time, we saw the win rates were 50% higher when they used, in this case, MedPick versus didn't. When I then took that to the team, everybody said, oh, I want to go do that. I want to be as successful as them. And actually got to the point where we didn't even need a top-down push for a new sales methodology. Just so many people had started doing the thing that was working for their peers. We really then just need to centralize it, right? Where it was already happening, but then it was really easy to get people on board. So that's an example of like, if you're hiring and the people you hire are doing better and you're documenting what you're doing to go get there, you can eventually present that to get the process changed, right? So I think that's one thing you can do over time. The other example I kind of gave is understanding why the current process is the way it is. both one, because I find nobody likes to have their idea be told that it's terrible, right? When you haven't even taken the time to understand why they're doing it in the first place. So, you're going to get more empathy and more understanding if you take the time to learn from others. But also I find oftentimes the answer to like, why do we do the interview process this way is some kind of example, like, I don't know, or
that's the way we've always done it.
Right, exactly. And so there's a lot of times where people are like, oh my gosh, we've wanted to do something different, but like nobody's wanting to go take this on because they're so focused on everything else. And so I find sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when you just ask a couple questions, people will say, great, do you want to do that? Because we know this needs to be better, just nobody's been taking it on. So I think those are two ways you can maybe change it. But I think even without changing it, like I mentioned, that customer development process, if you just have a better idea what you're screening for, almost no matter what the process is, you're going to do better than people who woke up that day or like, oh my gosh, I have an interview on my calendar in 20 minutes. I wonder what I should go ask.
Yeah.
You're just going to do better than that person regardless.
Well, Garrett, this is why we had you on, because those are both way more appropriate and probably valuable options than what I used to do, which is I would just run a shadow interview process. I don't know if you've ever tried that before, but that always goes over well with the recruiting folks.
Well, so Chris,
and by the way, hang on, I want to just give Garrett a shout out. Thanks for firing up all the comments that we'll inevitably see now that about whether or not MedPick is an actual sales methodology.
Yeah, fair.
They're hitting us already.
Yeah, but Chris, I think like there are some like figure out what the process is. There's actually one part of the the interview loop process that I see at every company I go to and is a hill I'm willing to die on. And that
here we go.
Yeah, right. I think Garrett knows which one this is. But I think debriefs with the interview loop need to die.
Oh, well, how about pre-interview loop syncs?
Yeah, so telling them what you want to learn from them, what you want out of their conversation, what signal you're trying to get on. But like getting the entire crew back together to debrief on a candidate, I actually think is one of the worst things you can do as a hiring manager.
Why?
So it does two really bad things. The first is it codifies bias in that if you've got one person in the loop biased against a candidate, they have an opportunity to then influence and bias the rest of the people. And added on top of that, there's a hierarchical structure to almost any interview loop. You have people who, from various elevations of the organization, interviewing your candidates. And what happens if that junior level peer is now directly opposed to the CRO's opinion on a candidate? I think that is a conflict that doesn't need to be in public. And if people take great notes and provide the hiring manager with that feedback, you can resolve that without asking a junior level employee to tell someone like you, hey, I think you're wrong about the candidate.
That's fair. I mean, I would just say, like, as a hiring manager, my opinion, you're signing up to be able to cope with those nuances of structure, and you got to be comfortable with that. You're going to run into those things at some point as being a leader anyway. I thought you were going to go somewhere else different, and I'd love Garrett's take on this, but like, I think what happens in those group settings is feedback that should be really pointed gets watered down and dulled. And so you don't ever get the feedback that will actually help you make a crisp, concrete decision with any sort of conviction. You end up, Jeff, with like I think so-and-so, maybe a little weak in this area, but strong in this area. And oh, by the way, great culture fit.
Well, yeah. And it snaps back to our New Year's resolution episode where we talked about love that, which like people really willing to go at each other about a candidate or have very differing views is kind of wild. Right. So like what we used to do is if you were part of my interview loop, you were required to put in detailed feedback into the interview, whatever ATS system you're using. And then as the hiring manager, I'd sit down with the recruiter and try to synthesize all of that. And if something wasn't clear, I'd go back one-to-one. Also, it cuts out a week in your interview process. Trying to find the calendar for the whole stinking loop. right? You can move faster on a candidate if you're not trying to coordinate 5 calendars.
All right. I'll die with you on that last hill.
That's right.
Garrett, what do you got me there? Garrett, what do you think on this?
Well, first, I think that yes, there's many things that can be done asynchronously, and doing more things that way allows you to have synchronous time for the things that are most important have to be done that way. And so I think more people have to go think about how can I kind of have things be asynchronous so I can have the important things be asynchronous. But I think to the original piece around debriefs valuable or not, I think as with anything, if you just put a debrief in a vacuum, right? Take it away from interviewing for a second. Is the process of debriefing with individuals or doing a postmortem, so to speak, of a process, project, anything, is that a worthwhile activity? Is that something that can be valuable? I would argue that the short answer to that is yes. It's of course something that can be valuable and be helpful. That said, that doesn't mean that the implementation is typically effective or the implementation is typically correct. And so that's where I really agree with what Jeff was going through, right? The process of everybody gets in a room and just says what they think is not very structured, not very useful, riddled with bias, and runs into everything Jeff talked about around junior person with a dissenting point of view is not going to share if the senior person had a different one first, right? So that would be an example of a debrief that's not going to be useful and not be very helpful. You could debrief in a sense where maybe, let's say it was everybody submitted their feedback. I have this, and I'm now using the debrief not to talk about whether or not we can hire this candidate. Maybe we made that decision independently based off look at the feedback, but maybe we're going to talk about how we can make the process better. An example of that could be, hey, we're realizing it's taken us a week to schedule this thing because we have the process set up this way. That's not very useful. It's causing us to lose candidates. Now we want to go do something different. So that could be an example of debriefing in the interview process that's useful. I think, therefore, with most things debrief oriented, it's really about being very thoughtful as to why you're doing it, what you're trying to get out of it, how it needs to be structured, who needs to be there. And if you put that level of thought in it, it tends to go better. So like as an example, deal reviews is another great example of this, actually. We actually at Raise have it where the most junior person has to give their feedback on a deal first, and the most senior person has to go last. And that's intentional because you don't want the scenario where the senior person says X and then everybody else just agrees with it, right? Yeah. You want to actually get the different perspectives out there because the most important thing is doing the right thing. And, that's hard for me because I have thoughts and I'm usually the one who goes last, right? So I want to come in and have thoughts and kind of get there. But very, very often people will come up with ideas and I'll go, I wouldn't have thought about that. That's a lot better than my idea. And I'm really glad that they spoke up and said that, because not only are we doing the better thing on this deal, I've now learned something. And the next deal, maybe that person wasn't in the room and that actually would have been the best idea. Now I can actually also share that idea there. So there's like things like that you can do to kind of help fix some of the structure. Or to Jeff's point, not only could you just have the feedback submitted ahead of time and go through it asynchronously, you can even have the feedback submitted ahead of time before doing a debrief, right? So maybe that helps make it so that people aren't as influenced in those conversations because they had to put on wax what they thought before having the conversation. So there's no opportunity for someone to change their point of view because they saw someone more senior thought something different.
On that note, one way I've seen debriefs work really well is you submit your feedback in your quote unquote evaluation, rating, hire, no hire decision, whatever, before the debrief. And the debrief is, tell me, tell the group what you talked about with the candidate, what examples they gave, what stories they told, et cetera, et cetera. And on more than one occasion, I've been part of debriefs for hiring groups where we found candidates that had, let's just say, told extremely inconsistent narratives about their background and their previous experience. It had nothing to do with, did person A think hire versus no hire, person B senior disagreed, et cetera, all that political stuff. It's just purely like a very factual, this is how the conversation went. The next person goes and boom, all of a sudden you've discovered either a common theme, maybe you want to hire based on that, or maybe some less honorable approaches to the interview process.
And going back to like a deal review example, right? Or deal inspection, whatever terminology you want to go use or however it works at your organization, right? Oftentimes, right, the classic one is, XYZ person's my champion, right? Champion. And then the sales manager might go, How do you know that? Have you tested them? What have they done to demonstrate that they're a champion? And then in that process, the person leaves the deal overview and goes, oh, I don't really have a champion yet. I need to go develop that. That's an example of a debrief that I think can also be helpful. That's similar to what you mentioned in an interview process. So it could be someone puts, man, they're really curious. And that's just what they put in the feedback. And you want to use the debrief to go, well, what are some examples of that? Right? Just like we want evidence-based pipeline, maybe we want evidence-based, examples of those traits. And so maybe the evidence is they asked me 15 questions during that call. I've never been asked so many questions about the company role from any other candidate before. Oh, okay, right. Or it's like, well, why do you think they're curious? It's like, I don't really know. They seemed inquisitive. And it's like, okay, well, seemed inquisitive is pretty subjective. Maybe we don't actually have that strong of signal in that example. So those are examples where I think a debrief could be useful, right? And that is also an example where it's not challenging people's feedback per se of pitting different views together. It's just confirming that there's actually evidence that supports what's been written. So that way you're kind of maybe double checking someone's work.
Yeah. Or taking that example one step further. Why do you think they were curious? Oh, they asked me 15 questions. Well, what kind of questions did they ask you? And then you get a laundry list of questions that all could have been answered by that person just looking at the company's website. Now that's different than being curious. I think that we'd call that like maybe being lazy.
Totally, right. But those maybe become things that become helpful if you have multiple candidates that you like, you only have one role and you're trying to go decide of, what's the level of curiosity someone has, right? Yep. Is it the amount of questions they ask or is it the perceived caliber of them?
Yep.
So Garrett, as we come to the end of our time together, one of the things we try to do on this, in these conversations is end on something that somebody, we record on Fridays, we release on Mondays, that someone can listen to Monday morning and start using, right? The brand new year. A lot of people just started their fiscal year. Budgets are now firmed up. Open recs are getting opened. And a lot of these frontline managers are starting to build out their team for the next calendar year. What are just a couple pieces of advice that you'd give that person who, had 3 open recs land on their desk in the last couple of weeks? Where do they start?
Yeah. I think there's 3 things that immediately come to mind. 2, I think we talked about a little bit ahead of time.
Yeah.
1, I don't think we did, but I think that's really, really important to kind of, especially for a first-time manager or second-time hiring manager. So I think the first one is run that customer development process, right? We all have the ability to go think of 10 to 15 questions that we would go ask individuals at our organization who've been successful, and maybe even ones who haven't been successful, if you want to compare or contrast, to go see what the commonalities are, right? If you're a big company, you can ask all the sales reps. If it's a small company and your CEO is doing the selling and your co-founder is doing the selling and someone else, ask them, right? Like you have the ability to go ask a few different people, no matter what size of organization you're at, to get some understanding as to how are people doing things? How are they seeing the world, and get some level of data to start doing some pattern recognition for. There's no reason you can't do that, no matter how big or small the company does. And it will just make sure that you better understand the commonalities behind success. And that will just make sure no matter what you do, you're more likely to then know what success looks like somewhere else. It's no different than they talk about in deals. If you have more at-bats, you know what it looks like. You're just giving yourself free at-bats to interviewing before you even start doing it for real. So I think that's kind of the first thing. Write down this 10 to 15 questions, find the 5 people you want to ask them, write down the answers, and then use that to go build your ideal candidate profile. I think the second thing is work with others, right? Build that personal board of directors to kind of help de-risk your circumstance, right? Whether that's other people who've hired successfully at your company, whether it's people that you followed on LinkedIn and like the content they post about interviewing, whether it's like connections through friends. Everybody has the ability, right? If you've done social selling, right, to go find 4 or 5 people that you can go talk to go run things by who are in similar situations to where you are. I think there are very few jobs that people can do outside of like CEO of Microsoft or something where someone hasn't done it before. And so you will be more successful if you find people that are just one step ahead of you in your journey who've done some of the things you're about to do, interviewing in this case and building your team, and kind of using them as sounding boards for when you get stuck. Because you will. You're inevitably going to get stuck. It's new, it's different, it's expected. Use other people's experience to help you get unstuck versus having to learn through mistakes the entire time. So I think that's the second thing that everybody can go do is build that personal board of directors. And the third thing, which I don't think we talked about, which I think is very, very important, is don't settle. I think there's a lot of pressure when you're a first-time hiring manager to I have an open seat. I need to have someone there, right? I'm losing revenue every day. Someone's there. Or I just got this role. I need to prove that I can go do this. I really want to go bring someone in. Or it's like, I maybe was promoted from being peers to everybody else. And it's like, I need to have someone that like I can start from scratch with, right? And they'll respect me. And like, I will have been the one who brought them in, and it'll be a different level of ownership or relationship. Like there's many reasons why I think people can feel inclined to, I need to go do this quickly. And to be clear, the goal is to hire the best person you can as quickly as possible. So I'm not saying move slower, but I find what happens a lot of times, and I think this may have been the Love That example, is that people will talk themselves into people. You shouldn't have to go talk yourself into it, right? At the end of the day, if you've run through these processes, if you've defined what success looks like, if it doesn't meet that and you're not really, really excited about it, probably not the person you need to hire, right? No different than on a deal, right? We all know when we left a deal in the pipeline just because we didn't want our manager to ask us why our pipeline coverage was terrible, when we know that deal is probably not going to go close. But it just makes us feel better having it in the pipeline. We don't want to do similar things on the hiring perspective, right? It is better to wait because, again, all the way to my point at the beginning of the conversation, right? When you got someone at 300% of the dashboard and someone at 0, waiting an extra month when that's going to be the delta between potential and performance isn't going to matter in the grand scheme of things. Or you can just have those extra leads go to a different rep on your team that's already performing, right? So it's just like you're going to do better if you choose not to settle and not lower your bar. It's very hard to do that as a first-time hiring manager or kind of a newer manager at an organization. But I've never met anybody who's ever regretted kind of holding out for someone they feel better meets the criteria they're looking for.
Yeah, it's the comparison to the criteria you're looking for, not a comparison to the 3 other candidates that you also interviewed. That's like the curse that a lot of people fall for. So
yeah, and if Garrett, these are good, the question is, well, why can't I find the right candidates? Right? That's now the question you be asking. Not should I hire this person? It's how do I work with recruiting? How do I start sourcing myself? How do I build a brand on LinkedIn so people want to come work with me? How do I network more to find more individuals? Right? It's figuring out how do I get what's needed to be successful, because your job is to hire people who come in and achieve. Yeah. And so if you know they need certain criteria to achieve and you can't find people who have that, when you hire them, you're not successful, right? That's the start of the journey, right? Success comes when 2, 3, 4 quarters down the line, they're the person at SCO getting an award and going to President's Club. That's when you've been successful.
Awesome. Garrett, we appreciate your time and your wisdom. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jeff.
Talk soon.